Hello, everyone. Your bearded reviewer again. And I'm going to do a little review of a book called Bruce Lee, Woodstock, and Me. And this is the memoir of a guy called Fred Weintraub. It's not about Bruce Lee, but it is about a guy called Fred Weintraub. And just to read the blurb, Fred Weintraub has had a profound but under-recognised influence on American popular entertainment. His entertaining memoir shows him to be more than just a cultural pathfinder. He's also a teller of truth. His influence on the entertainment world has been extraordinary. From The Bitter End to Woodstock to Warner Brothers Studio, his support of and belief in many of the great talents of his time stands second to none. So anybody that knows me knows that I'm a big Bruce Lee fan. And, I kind of love to read about Bruce Lee and admire his work as a martial artist and a filmmaker. So I was kind of interested in this book because Fred Weintraub was basically the guy that introduced Bruce Lee to the West. He was one of the main producers of Enter the Dragon, which is like the big, it's like Star Wars for science fiction. Enter the Dragon is like that for martial arts movies. But after reading the memoir of Fred Weintraub, what I realized was that his influence on entertainment basically goes back to about a half century. He is reading about him, he's an incredible guy. When you read his memoir, first of all, I think it's well written. It's funny, and it brings across his character because he's a kind of funny, free-spirited kind of guy. And that kind of shows up in his life. Fred Weintraub is the guy that when he was a young Jewish boy brought up in New York, and he was brought up in his father's business. His dad had a pram shop, and it was a successful pram shop, selling prams and toys and things. And he basically took that business from one shop to 50 shops. Now, for most people, that would be enough. 50 shops is a lot, right? But what actually happened is in his 20s, after he'd done this, he was bored rigid. So he basically, he was so fed up, almost fed up with success, or fed up with that success. And he pretty much walked out on his wife and 2 kids. Not the 2 kids so much. I think he wasn't happy in the marriage, and he just wasn't happy doing what he was doing. So he kind of walked out on it, got a divorce, ended up in Cuba, doing all sorts. And he writes great about this stuff. I mean, he's a fantastic writer about some of the experiences. Like, he ends up being a piano player in a brothel and things like that. So he's like a real free spirit. And he goes out and it just has all these experiences, ends up in jail, ends up getting thrown out of Cuba. And he comes back and wonders what to do with himself, and along one of the stages, he sees this old building full of drug addicts and things like that and stuff, decides to turn it into a little cafe. And he opens it up, and there's a wall that's covered in plaster, and they chip off about the plaster, and there's this great brick wall behind it, and he keeps chipping it off, and there's this beautiful brick wall behind it. And what he ends up doing is setting up one of the first kind of comedy clubs. In fact, probably one of the first major comedy clubs. And when you see a comedy club now, you always have that iconic image of a mic with one comedian and maybe like a brick wall behind it. Well, that was the look. That was started by this guy. That look was started by this guy, Fred Weintraub. And the club was called The Bitter End. So anybody that knows about the 60s and things like that will probably, or maybe lived through that, will know about this club called The Bitter End, because it introduced loads of people like Woody Allen to it, people like Neil Diamond, folk singers who started off as folk singers. They started off in this club and got the experience. And because it wasn't like a kind of polished thing, all sorts of people were coming through. I mean, he was telling, in this book, he was writing about how, people like Joan Rivers, all these comedians would come through. Now, if you think about it, that image of the brick wall and the mic is now the standard image for comedy clubs all over the world. This is the guy, Fred Weintraub, that had the idea of doing it. And again, there was no plan. He just kind of did it by the seat of his pants and thought, well, this is a good idea. And let's try this out. And it became kind of like a real magnet for all this kind of talent. And when you read through the book, all these people came through this place. All these comedy stars, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, all these kind of people, they were all coming through this comedy club. Bill Cosby, and then, they went through and then became big in other places. So this guy did this, and this Bitter End place became it was in the Village, New York, and it became this big, massive, kind of iconic place to be. And it's still going, apparently, I think. The Bitter End, it's called. And it turned into a TV program, and that became quite successful, and all this kind of stuff. And then at one point, one of his friends says to him, would you like to come and work for Warner Brothers, the film studio? Now, unbeknownst to him, Warner Brothers was about to close down and was going to go out of business. But this friend got him involved in it, and he ended up going from this club thing to being a studio executive, and he knew nothing about how that works. So he did that, and the first project he took on was a movie called Woodstock. And basically it was to make the documentary about a little concert that was going on at that time in a place called Woodstock. Anyway, anybody that knows anything about the 60s knows that people talk about the Woodstock generation. It was like zone in, free love, hippie, all that kind of stuff. And that became like the signature of this whole generation of Woodstock. And he did the documentary. They did a documentary and nobody wanted to do a documentary movie because they thought documentaries don't make any money. But what he decided to do was he used this different split screen thing, and he put loads more cameras in, and they took, they filmed ordinary people as well as just the thing on stage, the action on stage. They filmed ordinary people just talking about stuff. So this documentary apparently became a big success and saved Warner Brothers. So this guy, Fred Weintraub, literally saved Warner Brothers. So things like that, this guy's kind of done. And then, of course, one of his friends happened to be a martial arts instructor called Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee really wanted to break into the movies and television. And this guy tried to get him into a series called Kung Fu. He wasn't accepted for Kung Fu because they thought they wanted somebody who was more kind of Caucasian, basically. But, he also says, look, it's also because Bruce Lee wasn't that great an actor, and he wasn't that good for all the sensitive stuff, and his accent was quite thick. That's what he says. So anyway, Bruce Lee, he advised him to just go away to Hong Kong, make a couple of movies, get a bit of experience, and then he would use that. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And when Bruce Lee made a couple of movies in Hong Kong, they broke all box office records there. And then he had this idea of having a Western-made movie. So that was when because he was involved with Warner Brothers, they collaborated with a company in Hong Kong called Golden Harvest, and they decided to put on this production called Into the Dragon, which was basically a vehicle for Bruce Lee. And of course, it broke all box office records. I think they made it for less than $1 million back then. Today, it's made over $1,000 million dollars, and it's So, and of course, it created the kung fu craze. And like he said before, Into the Dragon, every small town in America had a beauty parlor, a little church, and then after Into the Dragon, every small town in America had a little church and a beauty parlor and a karate school. So he really changed the culture and introduced something there. So that was really good to read about. And yeah, so I think what comes across with this guy Fred Weintraub is that he's been in the movies, music. He's been a figure behind the scenes. Nobody's heard of him, but he's been a guy that's been kind of involved in that. And the book itself is funny. His spirit comes across, which is like, it's very free-spirited, nice guy, actually. I really liked, you're really warm to the guy. And he talks very candidly about some of his romantic, encounters, which are actually quite funny sometimes. But anyway, so I thought this was a good memoir. It's called Bruce Lee, Woodstock and Me. Anything with Bruce Lee in the title usually sells quite a lot. And I think that was probably a bit of a cynical move on his part. But Bruce Lee, Woodstock and Me by Fred Weintraub. He's actually written it with a ghostwriter called David Fields. But it's the memoir of Fred Weintraub. It's a fun book to read. Found it very interesting. And it's much more than just his relationship with Bruce Lee. You realise that he's been around, like I said, entertainment culture for probably half a century and had quite a huge influence on that. So hope you enjoy that. Thank you. Take care. Bye. And please keep those book reviews coming. Always enjoy them when anybody does one. Okay, take care. Bye.